Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out today to join us here at Y7. My name is Dannery Kong. I am the Global Connectivity and Trade Track Sherpa of the Y7 Summit. We welcome you to listen and engage with these distinguished upcoming leaders of the G7 member states in the European Union as we kick off the summit. Within our Global Connectivity and Trade Track, I have the wonderful opportunity to work with these amazing leaders to collaborate, debate, and challenge the status quo by finding solutions to the world's most pressing issues. I will now hand over the presentation to Mohammed, Delegate of the United Kingdom, to start off our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rannery, and a big thank you to all the YPFE Secretariat for putting together such an amazing event in virtual circumstances. I can say on behalf of myself and all of my fellow delegates that we thoroughly appreciate the effort that you've all gone through to make this as successful as it has been so far and will continue to be. And huge hello to all of the participants and everyone watching around the world, wherever you may be. As Rannery mentioned, my name is Mohammed Abdurrahman. I'm the UK delegate for the Global Connectivity and Trade Track, and I'll be kicking off the presentation, and then you'll one by one hear from each of the delegates going throughout the presentation and just try to put you through, firstly, the process of our communique, and secondly, the communique itself and our aims for it. So if we could have the next slide, please. So to kick off, the first major issue that we had was to define the terminology. So with regards to trade, it's generally well known what is meant by it. You have the movement of goods and services across borders, along with some other aspects, but within reason. However, we wanted to make it as clear as possible which aspects of trade that we were going to look at, and we then wanted to ensure that the issues we explored throughout the communique were addressed or touched upon in the definition for consistency and cohesiveness. There were common themes throughout the policy proposals submitted by each delegate, and a combination of these and input into the final product created where we are now. With regards to the definition for global connectivity, it took a significantly longer time. On the first initial call that we had, the final message before everyone logged off the call was, okay, so how is everybody going to define global connectivity? From this, it became a recurring theme that required urgent attention, because the sooner we created some sort of definition and agreed upon it, the sooner we could create relevant policies, or rather group them appropriately. People began throwing ideas around regarding what should be included and what it could potentially be comprised of. And there was consensus on some things like the internet and digitalization and the like. However, other things had to be discussed further before being agreed upon. I'm sure as you read the communique, you'll be able to see some of the differences and similarities. Along with each definition, we wanted them to include their own calls to action to outline the basis of the communique and what the overarching aims were, which is why, as you see on the screen now, the definitions are in the sentences, but then when you do eventually read the communique, you will see that after each sentence, there is a call to action and what generally we would like the communique to put forward and the proposals that we would like the G7 leaders to listen to. With regards to which aspects come under which category, there were multiple discussions that were had on this topic. For instance, do we separate them or do we categorize them within groups? We chose to leave it as it is because some of the topics are quite broad and cover aspects of both global connectivity and trade, which is why, as you currently see or will see throughout the presentation, we have digitalization, data governance, multilateralism and trade, and taxation. And a lot of these take aspects of both global connectivity and trade. And with that, I will hand over to Anne, who will take us through the negotiation process.
Hello, my name is Anne. I'm part of the German delegation. So, about the negotiations process. For all of us, the process of putting the youth voice to paper began before we even met in person in the Global Connectivity and Trade Track. All the delegations conducted at least one, either online surveys and/or virtual consultations. The surveys were an option to reach hundreds or even thousands of young people in our respective countries. However, it was also a very standardized way of gathering information. Therefore, the more meaningful interactions were through our virtual consultations. We were able to talk to and discuss with youth their pressing issues and pressing concerns and issues, and how to best represent their political views at the Y7 Summit. When finally we met together to form the Global Connectivity and Trade track, each delegate got the chance to create and present their own policy proposals. The points brought forth in the presentations then allowed us as a track to identify key points and synergies between our aims. We especially thank our Sherpa, Valerie, for guiding us in identifying those overarching themes from the great variety of proposals. At this point, time was virtually flying by. While we were debating on what we wanted to keep, what we wanted to change, to merge, or to drop from our part of the communique. But fortunately, we could reach a satisfactory agreement for all on this topic. And once we agreed on the overarching theme for our part of the communique, we returned to formulating policy proposals. Every delegate has some special expertise in one area or another. So allowing delegates to take on a leadership role by guiding those parts of the discussion as experts in their field allowed us all to improve our knowledge in some way or another. May it be about health issues regarding COVID-19, may it be about trade reforms, tax frameworks, or about environmental and sustainability issues. So to finalize our section of the communique, once our policy proposals were in place, there were numerous discussions regarding wording, grammar, how to different sentence structures may change the meaning of our proposals. And altogether, it was a very delicate process, as we expected, because we wanted to make sure that the communique is as concise as possible while keeping all of its meaning and impact. So, and with this, and the next slide, please, I'll hand over to Shinji.
Great. So hi, I'm Shinri Kamei, and I'm a part of the Japanese delegation. The first part of our communique is on digitalization, defined as the integration of digital technologies into everyday life. In particular, we wanted to call on the G7 to close divides and inequalities in digitalization because existing gaps grossly exacerbate gaps in access to opportunity. We considered some key factors as we created our communique. So currently, only 57% of the world's population has access to internet. Large gaps in access also exist within both developed and developing countries. The impact of these gaps has become especially stark as schools and companies have shifted remote due to COVID-19. The UN estimates that 1.5 billion students impacted by school closures. More than 40% of them, so 600 million learners, do not have internet access at home or an ability to connect to their teachers and friends. Private sector companies have the know-how to efficiently increase digital infrastructure, but may not have the right financial incentives to build in underserved areas. Because of this, our recommendations are as follows. We call upon the G7 to close divides and inequalities within digitalization. Access to the internet and digital infrastructure, including electricity, should be made available at an affordable cost and sensible quality to everyone. There should be a focus on closing divides and inequalities in terms of countries and regions with different levels of development, different from size, gender, age, and ethnicity. So we call upon the G7 to do 4 things. So first, establish a G7 task force comprised of G7 and recipient country representatives, technology companies, and representatives of local stakeholders with the mandate of expanding digital infrastructure in underserved areas. Second, adopt innovative and synergistic financing tools to blend public and private capital, such as public-private partnerships, or implement a framework of tax incentives for firms that make the aforementioned investments in underserved areas. Third, support public investments for digitalization of public services and the digital transformation of small and medium enterprises. And finally, reduce inequalities by co-creating digital technologies with and for marginalized communities. And with that, I will pass it over to our next delegate, Samantha, to talk about data governance.
Hi, I'm Samantha, the head delegate of the United States delegation, and the Global Connectivity and Trade Track calls on the G7 leaders to regulate data collection and data usage while protecting human rights. So there's an increased number of organizations and institutions converting their business practices to digital formats, increasing the amount of data collected. For this reason, we call on G7 leaders to create an independent international authority to regulate data collection and usage while promoting interoperability. It should provide regulatory frameworks on artificial intelligence that foster innovation and growth while preventing the violation of civil liberties and privacy. The authority should be governed by a balanced representation of all relevant stakeholders, both public and private, including civil society. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of protecting human and civil rights while leveraging digital solutions to protect citizens. We call on G7 leaders to conduct and publish the results of a quarterly national review of the necessity and impact of the use of personal data, for instance, in the example of contact tracing, in managing the spread of COVID-19, and to regularly revisit regulations about the level of access into people's personal data and lives. Additionally, we call on G7 leaders to de-identify data of individuals to maintain anonymity and privacy. If we could have the next slide, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Enrico Nano, and I am part of the EU delegation. And I will walk you through our third topic on multilateralism and trade. Youth across the G7 call on their leaders to protect and support the multilateral institutions and systems we have in place today. In order to ensure transparency in the global trade system, in light of the large costs and frictions associated with the increasing number of bilateral trade agreements, we call on G7 leaders to take more ambitious multilateral actions, working with the World Trade Organization by, first, mandating sustainable impact assessments carried out by an independent body for all parties concerned in trade negotiations to assess all impacts of trade agreements, including social and environmental ones. Second, we urge the WTO to agree upon binding definitions of developed and developing countries within their framework to assure that assistance and exemptions from regulations reach appropriate recipients. And third, to strengthen the role of the WTO as an advocate for the environment through initiating new regulations that also take into account the economic needs of developing nations and disadvantaged societal groups. Now over to Audrey.
Hi, I'm Audrey from the French delegation to the Global Connectivity and Trade Track, and we would talk a little bit on the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. This crisis has emphasized the urgent need to take multilateral actions to ensure global trade, financial stability and resilience, and to allocate sufficient resources to tackle the pandemic and its consequences. We therefore call on G7 leaders to take the following action. First, lifting tariffs and exports ban on medical supplies. Encourage other countries to follow suit and show solidarity, especially with developing countries, via a tariff and aid initiative, for instance, that could be comprised of a worldwide cancellation of tariffs on imported medical supplies and compensation to developing countries for revenue losses incurred from cancellation. Second action could be to support the cancellation of debt repayment of developing countries at least for 1 year, while not reducing the official development aid, and to further develop financial instruments to help them respond to the negative economic shock. So, for instance, some instruments that could be implemented in the International Monetary Fund as the special drawing rights, for instance. We would also call for the fourth action to strengthen the operational capabilities of the World Health Organization with all member states adhering to their budgetary commitments and expanding existing multilateral efforts to fight against pandemics, including the World Health Organization Strategic Preparedness and Response Plan and the United Nations COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response. Fourth, I would like to reinforce international scientific collaboration for research and development regarding all solutions to COVID-19 pandemic, including a potential vaccine, and make them accessible to everyone whenever they become available and regardless of who develops them, and make them available at an affordable cost based on the local purchasing power. And fifth, we would call on G7 leaders to minimize restrictions on the movement of people and goods across border as much as possible, of course, within the limits of the official public health guidelines. And I will now give the speech to the following delegate on the next slide, please.
So, hi, my name is Nicola, and I'm the Italian delegate in this track. So, last but not least, we focus on taxation. So, the U7 calls for a multilateral approach to ensure that the international tax framework is fair and transparent, recognizing the challenges arising from transformation in global value chains by, first, supporting the current multilateral effort under negotiation at the OECD, in particular, the inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting. The revised framework should ensure that international businesses pay a minimum level of tax, which is in line with the effective tax rates applied to domestic businesses. The new regime should be based on the mandatory accession of multinationals. Second, increasing progressively in income and wealth taxation, in particular for financial transactions and for the highest income brackets, in light of the decades-long decline in the labor share of income. Third, reforming tax system to boost green and inclusive growth, looking at SDGs targets, encouraging long-term sustainable development. So as we are the global connectivity track, we actually skipped a slide of the presentation, the challenges and considerations. So I would like to call my friend Raul to present it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to take a quick opportunity, actually, just to acknowledge the traditional territories and people of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, where I'm speaking to you from today, and also to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the city of Calgary, who include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda, the Bearspaw and Wesley First Nations, and also the Métis Nations of Alberta in Region 3. And so with that, I'd like to actually just jump into the challenges and considerations. And of course, you know, our first consideration was to clearly define the track and the limits of our track. So I thank our colleagues Mohammed and Shinri for providing the definitions that allowed us to frame the debate on a vast number of issues that fall under global connectivity and trade. As you will already have seen, our communique sort of covers quite a few areas. And so we saw an opportunity, of course, to address digitization under global connectivity, but we also wanted to add language in support of multilateralism as the process that inherently connects us all. We took time to discuss and select the main points of interest while considering each perspective and recognizing our proposals stemmed from consultations with youth across the G7, not just our respective countries. Through these consultations, we compiled issues that matter to youth the most, while ensuring that we were also staying current in our addressing the COVID situation as well. The great thing to see, and that's been mentioned before, is that we had a great number of suggestions that overlapped from proposal to proposal. I really want to thank each delegate on this track for considering how we could create proposals that covered more than one issue. So therefore, you'll see support of a multilateral path forward in our mention, support, and incorporation of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and the OECD, and how they can help support the vision for better outcomes for youth. One of the main challenges we faced coming from different countries and not necessarily having the same cultural and societal backgrounds was the need to ensure that we place the same meaning on the concepts behind each word. When having disagreements on the phrasing, we would go back to the idea that we'd like to pass and find a way to communicate those policy points in a way that would represent everyone's point of view. Again, thank you to everyone on this track for often compromising and consistently taking a step back to ensure that we're proposing policy that would benefit the entirety of the G7. Finally, the entire process of engaging online was a bit of a challenge. I do not think any of us think that this format will be the future of the Y7 or the G7, as we have come to realize that human interaction is paramount to getting things done. Aside from having to adjust to fit to everyone's time zone and rotate in hours of meetings, we try to, as much as possible, replicate the conversations and offshoot gatherings to share perspectives and have more in-depth conversations. In the spirit of unanimous agreement based on decision-making of the G7, each delegate kept an open mind and came to the table with solid proposals, and when we disagreed, we came with solid and concrete solutions as well. Thank you.
Okay, so since that is the end of our presentation, let's go ahead to the question and answer. We have a question saying, regarding the independent international authority to regulate data and usage, why and how did you choose this very ambitious policy? If anyone would like to answer this.
Sure, I can take that one. The reason why we chose to take on such ambitious policy is because it's the job of the Y7 to really create a space for dialogue that allows us to kind of shoot for the stars, if you will, with policy proposals that our leaders need to take on. We are not ignorant to the fact of the challenges and the environment that we're working with, but we do see it as our responsibility to be ambitious and really think outside of the box when it comes to creating policy proposals that our leaders need to address and, you know, add to the formula of G7 answers to global issues.
I'm just going to add to what my colleague Rahul said. As well as it being the job of the Y7 to have some ambitious views and proposals, there hasn't been for quite a long time now the creation of an organization or a body that has the sole purpose of what we're proposing. And for that reason, and because we feel like it's such a crucial point for us to look at, we thought it could be feasible, and it is something that we wanted to put in and emphasize. There was also the conversation quite a few times amongst ourselves on whether it could be, in fact, working in collaboration with a different body, potentially the ITU, for example. So along with that along with what Rahul said, is the reason for us having that in our communique.
Okay, our next question is, do you think the reduction or removal of patients when it comes to medical supplies will aid the global community in its reform for COVID-19?
I can take that one. So basically what we are going to need now is to have solutions ready for COVID-19, and we are not that much close to this. So maybe that could be a way, but first we need to work together, and I emphasize on the together, to find solutions. We talked about potential vaccines. There are also other solutions, also within health systems, that can be implemented. But working together and collaborating is the only way for us. And I'm happy for any of my other fellow delegates to jump in and add on this.
Okay, so the next question is, do you think ideas like universal basic income are a viable option, keeping in mind the current situation of global economy due to the coronavirus, and also because jobs are dying due to automation and technology?
Yes, I can take that one. Of course, this is a very hot topic in economic policy making, so I will give my personal consideration on that. So I personally believe it's a very valid policy, although economic research has not yet full agreement on its impact and actual validity. But given the declining labor share of income, favor of the capital share of income, in the advancement of the fourth industrial revolution, I personally believe universal basic income should be implemented in a wide scale, of course after some testing taking place. But it's very important how it is going to be framed. because it's crucial that it doesn't reduce the individual incentives to work, because although we might have in the future, because of technologies, as you say, 4 days working week, or working less hours per day, and so on and so forth, it's very important that the incentives to work are not reduced for people. And in the words of the Nobel Prize winner Muhammad Yunus, the work makes human dignity. So this is very important, and the UBI the UBI should not reduce that.
Okay, so the next question is, with regards to data protection, how can the data of those within the G7 nations be protected when interacting with transnational corporations due to the myriad of global data protection legislation approaches?
I can take this one. That is why we are encouraging a multilateral effort. We know that right now there are more than 120 regimes of data protection in the world, as well as we saw that after the European Union implemented the GDPR, we experienced a spillover effect, meaning that many other jurisdictions have implemented and introduced similar data regulations. What we think is that data can have an economic impact over the world economy, so countries have incentive to join a membership group with the same rules, so they can maximize the economic benefits of the flow of data.
Okay, our next question is, do you think restriction on people's movements will cause more damage to the global economy than closing their borders to control pandemic?
So about this, of course, we discussed the topic, and in our opinion, we should strive overall. We should strive for the free movement of people from all around the world, and all restrictions on that movement should be implemented only for a very serious reason, or for very serious causes. And during a pandemic, to foster public health and to prevent people, higher rates of infections, this can be an option which can be helpful and should therefore be undertaken to temporarily close, also to restrict the movement of people. But however, this should be these kind of measures should be evaluated from time to time, in close proximity, and these measures should be evaluated to decide when these measures become more of a burden than a help. Therefore, yes, this can help, and or these measures can help and will not lead to a bigger impact on the, or it will not lead to a worse impact on the economy than more people dying would do. But these measures should not be, for unlimited time, should not be implemented for an unlimited amount of time.
Okay, next question. How can governments take concrete steps towards reducing inequality and access to digital resources?
I can take this one. So there are a few ways that we could approach it in terms of concrete steps. The first, I think, is investment in digital infrastructure. So when we're talking about networks and connectivity systems, a lot of less developed countries are having trouble investing in those infrastructures, and they don't see it as enough of a priority when it should be, because even following from last year's Y7 communique, we have stressed continuously that access and equality of access to the internet and networks is something key for all people around the world. The second possibility is that local governments need to have better funding and better structured funding so that they can reduce inequalities, because when you have government funding at the national level, it doesn't always translate to the maybe some certain urban areas or more rural areas. So again, you miss a step when you're not looking at local government. And then finally, there needs to be better global collaboration in terms of developed countries realizing the flaws in developing countries' infrastructure and then helping them. So you have certain countries in the world kind of improving their infrastructure to 5G level, and then you have equally and simultaneously around the world other countries who don't really have access to, or where people struggle to have access to infrastructure and digital infrastructure and connectivity. So if developed countries could recognize that and start to aid, that would be a beneficial move for everyone.
Thank you. So here's the next question. Do you think cancellation of debt repayment will be a feasible step for developing countries?
Yeah, I can go ahead with this one. Definitely. This is actually part of our proposal, and it builds upon something that has been already done, and not to the extent we are proposing, of course, because we are the youth, and so we aim for something bolder and more ambitious. What has been done so far already is that countries, in accordance with the IMF, have postponed the debt repayment. But of course, this is not enough, because this will mean that even if you postpone debt repayment for 1 year, then the next year you will have to repay this year and the next year, and this will increase burden and possibly lead to government default. So what we are calling on is to cancel for at least 1 year debt repayment, both the interest and possibly also the principal of different countries' debt. And of course, we are not calling for a complete cancellation of all the debt, but in this period of hard times for every country with a global pandemic going on, and which is hitting very hard developing countries, G7 countries in particular should show solidarity in this respect, in this way.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, what is the impact of the U.S. sanctions and the U.S. trade war with China on global trade?
I can jump in here. So what we recognize is that there are imbalances in the current trade regime, but what we were aiming at with our communique was to foster a multilateral effort in trying to reform the current frame. So we know that bilateral trade agreements cannot benefit the world economy. So I think personally that the current so-called trade war between China and the US, as well as the current tensions between the European Union and the United States of America, are not going to help the world economy to recover after the pandemic. But I recognize that there are imbalances in the current regime, so we should work at a multilateral effort trying to possibly reform the current trade system.
Okay, our next question is, can you elaborate on what the new green regulations through WTO that account for the need of developing nations, disadvantaged groups would look like?
Yes, okay. So the idea behind this point is that we strive for two goals that we can only accomplish together, and that we both must accomplish. The one is that we have a problem with climate change, and we must act on it in the next years to prevent a disaster, which will, to prevent disaster and threatening the livelihood of millions of people all over the world. And the second point is that we want to strengthen the development of the economy, of emerging and developing economies all over the world. And in looking at these goals, we have recognized that in recent years the WTO has not been able to conceal those interests, and have therefore not been able to work properly towards ensuring actions against climate change. So what we want to aim for is therefore to take into account in negotiations within the WTO the needs of developing nations by, for example, taking measures that could raise the welfare of those disadvantaged groups and developing economies, and that are, according to, for example, also take measures that can increase jobs in developing countries, so that on the other hand we can establish through multilateral action and through the WTO measures to protect our global climate. Yeah, and we mostly want to recognize that we need both in order that we can agree as a community or all members of the WTO to agree on regulations that can achieve both of them. Yeah, so that can achieve to combat climate change. We need to also work on regulations to help those developing economies.
Okay, thank you. What can we do to maintain the multilateral world trade in connection under the increasing ideological difference in intentional unilateral action, intentional launch by some politicians?
I can go for this one. Well, I would say that we can do what we're doing now. So that means that we are youth. We are the youth. We are the one who's going to be in the world tomorrow. We are the one who's going to be leading the world tomorrow. And we're also the one who's going to be facing the consequences of what's happening today. So as such, we have the responsibility to talk all together, to raise our voices, and to raise our voices loud enough so that all our politicians can hear our voices, and just to make sure that what they're going to do is what we want for tomorrow. So yeah, as much as we can carry on with this kind of actions, I really hope that our communique at the Y7 is going to be pushed very, very loudly to our G7 leaders and even abroad that. But yes, we need to make our voices heard. And I guess maybe some of my friends want also to add on this.
Thank you. With the number entrepreneurship and startup businesses growing, how should the government provide access and ensure that the micro, small, and medium enterprises are included in the chain of connectivity and trade? And what do you think the challenges are?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. And I think this is exactly why digitalization is so important. So with the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen small and micro and medium businesses impacted disproportionately by COVID-19, partially because a lot of them sort of operate out of physical locations, but also because these are exactly the businesses that previously maybe didn't have an e-commerce presence, wasn't familiar with digital marketing, didn't necessarily yet know how to reach customers or find resources or opportunities online. And so by improving digital infrastructure across the world and closing those existing gaps, plus making sure that those small businesses also have the resources, the digital resources that they need, they can connect better with both their customers and the rest of the world.
Thank you. With the mass shift of jobs to the green energy sectors in the United States and around the world, what can we do for workers such as coal miners, steel workers, and hard pollutant labor jobs to keep them working and bring money home to support their families?
So I can take that one. I'm from one of the largest oil producing regions in the world here in Alberta, Canada. And so, this shift to green energy sectors is something that is doable. It is something that is scalable, and it's something that our governments are clearly ready to support. I think, what we can do for workers such as coal miners, steel workers, even folks in the oil industry, as you say, hard pollutant labor jobs, is we can be offering a number of upskilling and education opportunities offered by our governments. It's really a partnership across sectors here to ensure that we are educating youth on the importance of a green economy, to train them to be a part of it, but then also to not forget the generation that is currently in the workforce in these areas. Oftentimes people see climate change and climate action as being at odds with these industries, but it's important to note that we're not going to overnight walk away from these types of energy, but that we can support our economies and its workers in our transition to a green economy. They're not at odds with one another. And so when we're looking at supports for these families, yes, it's a difficult transition. Millions of people in my region of the world were out of work for a time there when oil prices went down. But there is hope for them in a new economy, a digital economy, where we can re-adapt skills to fit a greener world.
Thank you. Do you think that after the pandemic is over, the world will be able to cooperate with the loss that happened during this time?
Yeah, I can go ahead with this one. Yeah, so this pandemic is something unprecedented, as you it will affect definitely the multilateral trade order. It might also increase tensions, as we are already seeing, trade tensions in particular, and it is already leading to some reshoring trends. So production will get closer to where goods are consumed, and thereby shortening global value chains to more local value chains. However, history teaches us that usually multilateral trade bounces back from crisis, and we might see some reshoring trends in the near term, but also a coming back of longer chains in the near future. However, keep in mind that shorter value chains are also good for the environment in the sense that we tend to ship goods from one place to the other one to a lower extent. On the other hand, we also have the impact of digitalization and, of course, global connectivity, which has seen a large jump in this time of the this will likely bring several countries to shift from the manufacturing sector to the services sector. So we might witness an increase of GDPs of countries being shifted to the tertiary sector.
Thank you. Should democratic countries use adherence to human rights as a prerequisite for improving trade with other countries?
Thank you. I can take this one. So in our part of the communique, we also mention sustainable impact assessments, which encompass not only environmentally, economic, and social impact of trade assessments, but also human rights trade assessments. We want G7 leaders to commit to conducting these sustainable impact assessments. So it is only it is only a logical consequence that we also think that human rights and the adherence to human rights should play a role in how we decide on our trade relations.
All right, thank you. A large amount of online markets are dependent on the U.S. economy to act as a base foundation. As seen by COVID, a sudden shift in the U.S. economy has led to severe impacts on the global online markets. What is the Y7 thoughts on such an issue and the dependency on the U.S. as a basis for the online market?
I can jump in here. That is a very fascinating question, I think, because it's going to shape the future of the economy. And yes, I agree. We have seen during the COVID-19 that, for example, in Europe, the intermediation between digital services and customer was handled by the US tech giants, so Google, Amazon, Facebook. We know that the European Union is trying to work on more investments in the digital market. There was a leaked document published in 2019 in which the European Commission was proposing to create an European future fund, trying to foster investments in digitalization. So I think there is a rising concern in Europe about this topic. Also because I think what we are seeing right now is the merge of two different digital economies. So the one from China, led by the Chinese tech giants, so Alibaba, Tencent, and the one in the US. So that is a very fascinating question, and I don't have an answer because I think Europe and other countries have too much to catch up with the US. but I would say that much of the European policy industry in the coming years will be focused on digitalization, as the Recovery Fund published a few days ago was envisioned.
Thank you. Can you comment on worldwide cooperation on developing a vaccine for the coronavirus? How can we avoid a competition over it?
Well, we've talked earlier about increasing the international collaboration in research and development. So that would be a way. So, for instance, the firms that are working on solutions for COVID-19, so vaccines or other solutions, they can just talk with other firms from other countries, share the results of their work without asking any compensation back. And one of the things that we would also be calling for is that as soon as a solution is found, it has to be distributed to as many people as possible. And it has to be as free as possible to these people, or at least it has to be based on the local purchasing power, as we said in our communique.
All right, thank you. Do you think the SAPs would need to be restructured in response to COVID-19 and recent economic conditions? Do you think this restructuring could help with the vicious cycle of debt many countries face?
I can take this one. So SAPs, or structural adjustment programs, for those who don't know, are sometimes risky in general. Even before COVID happened, there was constant debate on whether they're beneficial or not. So there's a lot of economic literature on those conversations. The cycle of debt itself, as you mentioned, is harmful. Many developed countries can afford to kind of live with it and cope with it, although it's not ideal. Daily ask continues in those countries, with national debt being a significant proportion of GDP. One of our proposals, in fact, was to cancel debt repayments for developing countries for at least 1 year, and that's some of the sort of things that we're proposing. So along with structural adjustment programs potentially being looked at, because yes, they can be harmful sometimes. So maybe they could be restructured, and we do think, along with things like cancellation of debt repayments for certain countries, it could be beneficial for the developing world.
All right, thank you. In terms of the data governance and the protection of human and civil rights, what will be the extent of the data from corporations and online companies that could be included in such authorities and reviews?
Take this one. So the extent of the data from corporations and online companies that could be included into such authorities, and reviews, they will probably be up to the international authority and the governments involved. We specifically wanted to keep this call to action broad to make sure stakeholders have broad representation and they go according to whatever those countries' policies are. However, the OECD did come up as a possibility for a possible directorate, as they have a department for data governance. And so it would probably follow a similar framework as to what they've already been working with, and we look forward to seeing it in the future.
Thank you. How can we break the trade deadlock and turn the global economy around when the economy is stagnant or even negative?
Great. So I think this is a really important question, because if we think about the history of the WTO, one big piece was that following World War II, or prior to World War II, a lot of countries implemented protectionist policies, created trade blocs, and that was actually what helped trigger World War II. And following that, that's why the WTO was created, specifically in order to ensure that countries, all of its member countries, as many as possible across the world, follow multilateral trade policies. And so one thing that I think is critical for us and our leaders to be thinking about right now is the need to resist implementing excessive protectionist policies with the short-term objective of trying to protect local industries. Because what that will likely do is that it will trigger a protectionist arms race of trade policies for countries around the world that end up exacerbating the existing recession or even depression, and slow down economic recovery across the world by even more.
5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Here's the next question. Can you please elaborate how your communique promotes sustainable development?
So I can take that one. When we look at our communique and the text that we've put forward to G7 leaders, number one is this idea that politicians sometimes use financing for the Sustainable Development Goals as a bit of a scapegoat to, frame their lack of action or their inability to act. And so what we've done is we've gone to our through our communique to support the OECD's BEPS project. What that will allow G7 leaders to do is effectively create a large revenue stream, which will then allow them to put forward finances for SDGs 1 through 17. We said 1 through 17 in particular for that because we wanted to note that these revenue streams were coming from some of the largest multinational corporations in the world, which effectively have been taking advantage of tax loopholes for quite some time. If we repatriate these sort of funds, our leaders and our governments will have the ability to fund inclusion and policy that is inclusive of society across the board. Additionally, when we look at our support for multilateralism in particular, the institutions that we are naming, so the WHO, the WTO, the United Nations systems generally, the OECD, these are institutions that have their foundations in joint effort, where for the most part, voices from across demographics, from across regions and communities are brought to the table and represented. And so when we look at the multilateral effort in general terms, we believe that support for it is important in supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you'll see throughout our portion of the communique, we are calling on joint action. We are rejecting unilateral or bilateral type agreements, and we're hoping to fully fund, support, and protect the institutions that we have in place today to ensure that the work that needs to be done in the space of sustainable development can be done. Because a lot of the time when you look at multilateral institutions in particular, they spend so much time on reporting and showing what they're doing that, the work gets sidelined because politicians need, sound bites and they need reports to see where their money's going. What I would say to G7 leaders in particular is that they need to let the process work. They need to let multilateralism take the lead on sustainable development, and I think our portion of the communique does that really nicely.
Great, thank you so much. Next question, as our world becomes increasingly dependent on digital systems, how do we protect these digital systems from failures that can interrupt global connectivity and trade?
I can take this. So this really makes me think about a lot of what's been in the news over the past few days, which I think sort of reflects the fact that government regulation is not necessarily keeping up with a lot of the innovations in digitalization and connectivity around the world. So one thought is that we have to make sure that one reason that is going on, right, is that a lot of existing government leaders don't necessarily have the expertise needed to be able to prevent situations like this, even though digital systems are sort of a fundamental utility in the same way that energy or water might be. They just haven't spent sort of the time growing up and thinking about this. And so one thing to highlight is that we are exactly the people who have spent time growing up thinking about this. We got access to the internet very young. We've used social media. And so we need sort of young digitally native leaders to develop expertise and an opinion on different topics and then use their voices in order to try to influence policy and try to prevent sort of interruptions in global connectivity and trade that occur due to failures in digital systems.